The brass luggage cart rolled past me before I noticed him. I was reviewing the breakfast service reports from the terrace cafe when I heard a familiar laugh drift through the marble lobby. It was softer than I remembered, less confident somehow, but it carried the same rhythm that had once filled the little apartment where I spent 12 years trying to become someone else's definition of enough. I looked up. There he was. Daniel. 49 now, if I remembered correctly. He stood near the reception desk wearing an expensive navy blazer that fit slightly tighter around the waist than it probably had 5 years earlier. His hair had been carefully coloured, though the grey had begun winning the battle around his temples. Beside him stood a woman who couldn't have been older than 32, beautiful, perfect makeup, designer handbag, the kind of effortless elegance magazines spend entire issues trying to teach. He smiled at her. She smiled back. And neither of them had the faintest idea that every chandelier above their heads, every suite overlooking the ocean, every palm tree lining the private beach, every employee greeting them with practiced warmth, belonged to me. Not because I had inherited it. Not because I had married into wealth. Because I had built the company that quietly purchased this entire resort 3 years earlier. Daniel reached into his wallet to hand over his credit card. I reserved the Ocean Signature Suite, he told the receptionist, Daniel Carter. The young receptionist smiled politely. Of course, Mr. Carter, may I also verify your identification? I watched the exchange without moving. No one at the front desk looked toward me. That was intentional. Around the resort, most guests assumed I was another executive visiting from headquarters. My office overlooked the sea, but I spent most mornings walking the property in simple linen clothes, talking with housekeeping, checking kitchens, asking gardeners about irrigation schedules. Titles didn't impress me anymore. Operations did. Daniel glanced around the lobby. His eyes passed directly over me. Nothing. Not even a flicker of recognition. 5 years. 5 years since the divorce. 5 years since the afternoon he folded his shirts into 2 suitcases and calmly explained why our marriage had become predictable. I remembered every word. Not because I wanted to. Because ordinary people remember extraordinary pain with astonishing precision. When Daniel and I met, I was 26. He was 28. We weren't glamorous. We weren't exciting. We met because the accounting software crashed during a quarterly audit, and both our departments stayed until nearly 9 at night trying to recover missing invoices. Everyone else ordered pizza. I ordered coffee. Daniel noticed. You don't eat when you're stressed. I laughed. I forget. So do I. That became our first conversation. Nothing cinematic. No dramatic music. No instant certainty. Just 2 tired professionals comparing terrible office coffee. For the first 4 years, our life fit comfortably inside a modest 2-bedroom townhouse. Mortgage payment. Second-hand furniture. Weekend grocery shopping. Movie nights on an agging couch. We celebrated promotions with takeout instead of expensive restaurants. When the washing machine broke, we spent 3 Saturdays comparing prices before buying a replacement. It wasn't glamorous. It was stable. And I loved stable. Because stability had been rare growing up. My father believed financial security meant sleeping peacefully. My mother believed kindness mattered more than appearances. Neither cared about luxury. They cared whether promises were kept. Back then, Daniel seemed to believe the same things. He'd kiss my forehead before work. He'd bring me peppermint tea whenever deadlines stretched past midnight. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch without speaking for 20 minutes. Silence felt comfortable. Comfortable became familiar. Familiar became ordinary. Years later, I realized those words mean completely different things depending on who's saying them. To me, ordinary meant safe. To Daniel, ordinary slowly became invisible. My mother used to tell me a story from when I was 8. Every Christmas, our school held a small talent show. Children sang, danced, played piano. I wanted to build something instead. Using popsicle sticks, glue, cardboard, and tiny pieces of painted fabric, I spent almost 3 weeks creating a miniature hotel. It had 24 tiny windows, little flower boxes, handmade furniture, a lobby with microscopic chairs that took forever to assemble. The judges barely looked at it. First prize went to a girl who sang beautifully. Second prize went to twins who performed a comedy routine. I received an honorable mention. I cried the entire drive home. Not because I lost, because almost no one had stopped to examine what I'd made. My father parked the car halfway home. He turned toward me. "You know what hotels do." I sniffled. "They give people somewhere to belong for a little while." He nodded. "And who notices the foundation?" "No one." "Exactly." He smiled. "The strongest work usually isn't the loudest." I didn't understand that lesson until decades later. Daniel never met my father. He passed away before our engagement. But he adored my mother. At least in the beginning. She called him dependable, responsible, grounded. If someone had asked me then whether my marriage would survive 30 years, I wouldn't have hesitated. Absolutely. Without question. Life rarely announces the moment certainty begins to crack. It starts with tiny adjustments. Conversations becoming shorter. Compliments becoming rarer. Phones staying face down. Work trips lasting 1 day longer than expected. Nothing dramatic enough to accuse. Just enough to notice. Then ignore. Because love often chooses optimism over evidence. The promotion changed everything. Daniel became regional sales director at 42. The raise was significant. Nearly 38%. New clients. Luxury conferences. International travel. Executive retreats. Suddenly our weekends filled with people discussing investment properties, imported wine collections, and private clubs I'd never heard of. I attended because Daniel wanted me there. At first. Then one evening, while driving home from a networking dinner, he stared through the windshield. "You know what? You don't really fit with them." I thought he meant professionally. "I'm not in sales." "No." He hesitated. "I mean socially." I laughed. "I've never been especially social." "I know." Silence. "Then, you could make more of an effort." "What kind of effort?" He shrugged. "The clothes." "My clothes." "The conversations." "I was talking." "You mostly asked questions." "I like asking questions." "I know." Another silence. "They notice things." Something inside me tightened. "What things?" He kept driving. "You just." He searched for the words. A blend into the background. I looked out my window for the rest of the drive. Because sometimes the most painful criticism isn't loud. It's casual. Like mentioning the weather. As though describing an objective fact. Not realizing you've quietly rewritten someone's reflection. That became the pattern. Whenever we attended events, Daniel started offering suggestions. "Wear the blue dress." "You should straighten your hair." "Try talking less about work." "Smile more." "You don't have to analyze everything. They'll think you're intimidating." I mean, he'd quickly correct himself. Boring. Boring. Ordinary. Predictable. Words began collecting inside me like tiny stones in a pocket. Each one light enough to carry. Together. Heavy enough to change the way I walked. Ironically, work became the one place I still felt completely seen. I wasn't extraordinary there. I was effective. There is a difference. I had started as an operations coordinator. Within 14 years, I supervised logistics for 7 boutique hotels across 3 states. Occupancy forecasting, vendor negotiations, staff training, maintenance scheduling, guest satisfaction systems. I loved processes. If breakfast service slowed by 6 minutes, I wanted to know why. If laundry costs increased 4%, I investigated. If guests repeatedly requested earlier check-ins, I redesigned staffing schedules. Nobody applauded those improvements. But profits quietly increased. Employee turnover quietly decreased. Guest reviews quietly improved. Quiet success rarely attracts headlines. It builds foundations. I didn't know then that foundations would eventually become my entire future. One rainy Thursday evening, Daniel came home nearly 2 hours late. He looked distracted, restless. He poured himself a drink before saying hello. "We need to talk." Every marriage has sentences that immediately change the temperature of a room. That was one of them. I set down my book. "Okay." He remained standing. "I've changed." I waited. "I don't think we're growing in the same direction anymore." My heart started beating harder. Not because I understood. Because I suddenly knew I was about to. "I've met someone." There it was. 4 words. No shouting. No broken dishes. No dramatic music. Just 4 ordinary words, capable of dismantling 12 extraordinary years. I remember asking only one question. "Do you love her?" He closed his eyes. "I think I do." Think. Not know. Think. Strange how one uncertain word can somehow hurt even more than certainty. He sat across from me. "I've been trying to figure out how to explain this." "You don't have to." "I do." "No." I looked directly at him. "You already did." He rubbed his forehead. "You're a wonderful person." I almost laughed. Whenever someone starts with that sentence, nothing kind follows. "You're reliable." Reliable. "You've always supported me." Supported. But there it was. "You've become comfortable with being ordinary." I didn't answer. Because I finally understood. He wasn't leaving because I had failed. He was leaving because he had changed the definition of success. And I no longer matched the picture in his mind. The strange thing was, for the first time in months, I didn't feel invisible anymore. I felt perfectly seen. Just not by someone who understood my worth. I didn't ask who she was. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not even during the weeks that followed, while lawyers translated 12 years of shared memories into numbered paragraphs and financial disclosures. People often imagine divorce as endless arguments. Mine wasn't. It was paperwork. Calendars. Electronic signatures. Boxes labeled kitchen. Boxes labeled office. Boxes labeled winter clothes. Every ordinary object suddenly needed a destination. The coffee mugs we'd bought on our 2nd anniversary. The bookshelf we'd assembled incorrectly and laughed about for an entire afternoon. The faded blanket we kept in the living room because neither of us wanted to admit it should have been replaced years earlier. Nothing dramatic. Just quiet decisions. Those were somehow harder. Daniel moved into an apartment downtown while we finalized everything. According to the documents, our assets were divided fairly. The townhouse was sold, retirement accounts were split, savings were calculated to the last dollar. Our attorneys congratulated us on having one of the smoothest divorces they'd handled all year. Smoother. What an interesting word. Earthquakes can happen beneath perfectly smooth roads. About 3 months after the divorce became official, I learned her name by accident. Sophia, 30 years old. Marketing consultant. the same company that organized several of Daniel's executive conferences. A mutual acquaintance mentioned them without realizing I didn't know. They look so happy together. I smiled politely. I'm glad. And surprisingly, I meant it. Not because I had stopped hurting. Because I had finally accepted something that had taken me months to understand. I couldn't compete with a fantasy. Sophia wasn't really my competition. She represented an entirely different version of life. You can't compare a lighthouse to fireworks. One lasts for minutes. The other keeps ships alive for decades. They simply serve different purposes. The hardest part wasn't loneliness. It was routine. For 12 years I had cooked enough pasta for 2 people. Bought 2 movie tickets. Folded 2 sets of towels. Even walking through the grocery store felt strange. Half my shopping list had disappeared overnight. One evening, I stood in the cereal aisle staring at family-sized boxes for nearly 5 minutes. A little boy looked up at his mother and whispered loudly enough for me to hear. "Why is that lady crying?" I hadn't realized I was. I laughed, wiped my eyes, picked the smallest box available and went home. Healing rarely happens through dramatic breakthroughs. Sometimes it begins with buying less cereal. Work became my anchor. If I couldn't control my personal life, I could certainly improve operational efficiency. I started arriving before sunrise. Not because anyone expected it. Because empty hotels reveal things busy hotels hide. You notice the hum of ventilation systems. The scent of fresh coffee drifting through hallways. Housekeepers greeting each other before guests wake. Maintenance teams replacing light bulbs before anyone notices they burned out. Hospitality isn't really about luxury. It's about invisible effort. Guests remember how a place made them feel. They rarely remember why. That fascinated me. So I began documenting everything. Every guest complaint. Every unexpected compliment. Average check-in times. Elevator wait times. Breakfast traffic patterns. Seasonal staffing fluctuations. Within 8 months I had filled 11 notebooks. My colleagues joked that I measured things nobody else even noticed. They were right. I did. Because hidden patterns eventually become visible results. One Monday morning my supervisor stopped by my office carrying a stack of reports. "You've been busy." "I suppose." He placed one spreadsheet in front of me. Our coastal properties increased guest satisfaction by 14%. I nodded. I saw. Employee turnover dropped 21%. I saw that too. He smiled. You also reduced food waste by almost 19%. I had a good kitchen team. No. He leaned against the doorway. You built a better system. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it sounded impressive. Because nobody had ever complimented the way I thought before. Not my appearance. Not my personality. Not my social skills. My thinking. There is something deeply healing about being valued for the part of yourself you once believed nobody wanted. 6 months later, an email arrived that quietly changed everything. The subject line read: Confidential executive recommendation. A private investment group had acquired 4 struggling boutique hotels. They weren't looking for another general manager. They wanted someone to redesign the entire operation from the ground up. Occupancy had fallen below 53%. Guest ratings averaged 3.8 stars. Maintenance costs exceeded projections by nearly 30%. 3 management teams had resigned within 2 years. Most executives saw a failing business. I saw unfinished architecture. They offered me the position of Chief Operations Officer. I almost declined. The responsibility felt enormous. Then I remembered something my father used to say whenever I hesitated. If everyone already knew how to solve it, They wouldn't need you. Exactly. I accepted. The first property was located on the northern coast. Beautiful ocean views. Poor management. Employees looked exhausted. Managers blamed staff. Staff blamed ownership. Ownership blamed the economy. Everyone had an explanation. Nobody had a plan. During my first week, I met individually with 112 employees. Not department heads. Everyone. Dishwashers. Gardeners. Night auditors. Laundry attendants. Security officers. I asked each person exactly 3 questions. What slows your work down? If you own this hotel, what would you change first? What do guests notice before management does? The answers were extraordinary. Not because they were complicated. Because they were consistent. Managers hadn't been listening. Within 4 months, we reorganized housekeeping schedules, simplified inventory systems, cross-trained departments, updated maintenance reporting, improved breakfast logistics, redesigned check-in procedures. Nothing glamorous. Occupancy climbed from 53% to 68%. Guest ratings reached 4.4 stars. Employee resignations fell by almost half. Investors noticed. More importantly, employees smiled again. One afternoon, an elderly housekeeper named Maria stopped me in the hallway. I've worked in hotels 31 years. She reached for my hand. You know what's different? What? You ask us questions. I smiled. You have the answers. She shook her head gently. No. She looked around the hallway. We always had the answers. Her eyes met mine. You're the first person who believed that. I thought about Daniel. About networking dinners. About blending into the background. How strange. The qualities he considered ordinary. Patience, listening, consistency, were becoming the exact qualities transforming an entire business. Success didn't happen all at once. It happened property by property. 1 hotel became 3. 3 became 7. 7 became 12. By the end of the 4th year, our portfolio included 18 boutique properties across 5 states. Annual revenue had nearly tripled. Guest retention reached record levels. Industry publications started writing articles about our operations-first philosophy. They quoted executives, investors, consultants. None of them knew the philosophy had started years earlier with a little girl building a tiny hotel from popsicle sticks because she cared about foundations no one else noticed. Recognition brought invitations, leadership conferences, hospitality panels, business schools asking me to speak. I accepted some, declined many. Public speaking still made me uncomfortable. During one conference, a moderator introduced me as one of the most influential operational strategists in modern hospitality. The audience applauded. I almost looked behind me to see who they were talking about. Imposter syndrome has a strange sense of humor. After the presentation, an older gentleman approached me. Silver hair. Perfect posture. No name tag. I enjoyed your talk. Thank you. You focused almost entirely on employees. They build the guest experience. And shareholders. They benefit when employees succeed. He smiled. Interesting. We spoke for 23 minutes. About systems, leadership, long-term thinking. He asked thoughtful questions. Never interrupted. When we finally shook hands, he handed me a business card. I recognized the company immediately. One of the largest private hospitality investment firms in the country. At the bottom of the card was a handwritten note. Let's continue this conversation. That single conversation eventually led to the opportunity that would redefine the rest of my career. An agging luxury resort on the coast. Spectacular location. Magnif. Daniel looked toward the terrace where nearly 60 executives were waiting. Then back at me. I don't want to keep you. I appreciate that. There was another pause. The kind that exists only between people who once knew everything about each other and now had no idea where to begin. So, he said carefully, you're with the management company. I am. Regional. I smiled. In a manner of speaking. He nodded as though that answered the question. It didn't. But I wasn't interested in correcting him. Not because I wanted to impress him. Because my job title had nothing to do with the conversation standing in front of us. 5 years earlier he had known exactly who I was. My position on an organizational chart wouldn't change that history. It was good seeing you, Daniel. You too. Sophia smiled politely. I hope we didn't interrupt your meeting. Not at all. I watched them continue toward the gardens. For a brief second Daniel glanced back over his shoulder. Not with regret. With curiosity. As though trying to solve a puzzle. Then they disappeared around the corner. Lunch lasted another 45 minutes. Most conversations centered around expansion. We had recently identified 3 independent coastal resorts whose owners were preparing for retirement. One board member believed we should slow our acquisitions. Another argued the market favored bold decisions. I listened more than I spoke. That had always been my habit. Finally someone asked Evelyn. 30 faces turned toward me. What do you think? I folded my napkin before answering. We shouldn't buy properties. Silence. We should buy communities. Several people looked confused. I continued. A building isn't valuable because it has rooms. It's valuable because people trust it. I looked around the table. If employees don't trust leadership, if guests don't trust the experience, if local communities don't trust the business, the architecture eventually becomes irrelevant. The chairman smiled. I think that answers the question. The discussion moved on. I didn't notice Daniel standing briefly on the upper balcony overlooking the terrace. I learned about that later. Apparently he had stopped to admire the gardens. Instead, he watched an entire board of directors quietly waiting for me to finish speaking before continuing their meeting. Around 3 o'clock, I returned to my office. Waiting on my desk was a handwritten note from guest relations. Mr. Carter requested information regarding executive conference bookings. He seemed interested in the history of the resort. Interesting. I called downstairs. This is Evelyn. Good afternoon. I received the note. Yes. What exactly did Mr. Carter ask? He wondered which management company operates the resort. And we explained that the property is part of the Meridian Hospitality Collection. I smiled. Reasonable question. Did he ask anything else? He asked whether the executive team was visiting from headquarters. That's true. We told him today's leadership conference included senior executives. Perfect. There was a slight hesitation. He also asked whether he'd met someone named Evelyn Bennett before. I laughed softly. What did you say? Only that we couldn't discuss employee information. Correct. Privacy mattered. For everyone. Whether the guest was a stranger. Or someone who once knew exactly how I took my coffee every morning. That evening I skipped dinner in the restaurant and ate in the employee cafeteria instead. Chicken soup. Whole grain bread. Fresh fruit. Simple. Comfortable. Halfway through the meal, one of our newest interns sat across from me. Nervous, I asked. She nodded immediately. It's my first executive conference. You've done well. I spilled water this morning. I smiled. Did anyone get hurt? She laughed. No. Then you'll survive. She looked relieved. After a moment she asked, "Can I ask you something?" Of course. Were you always confident? I almost choked on my soup. Confident? She nodded enthusiastically. You walk into every room like you already know what you're doing. I couldn't help smiling. I usually don't. Her eyes widened. Really? Almost every important decision I've ever made scared me. Then how do you do it? I thought for a moment. You don't wait until fear disappears. You learn that fear doesn't always deserve the final vote. She quietly repeated the sentence to herself. I hoped she'd remember it longer than she remembered spilling the water. The following morning was Daniel and Sophia's final full day at the resort. According to the itinerary, they had reserved a private tour of the property before checking out the next afternoon. Normally those tours were handled by guest experience. Unfortunately, the assigned manager called in sick with food poisoning. My assistant stepped into my office. We have a small problem. I looked up from a budget report. What happened? She explained. I'll find someone. I've already checked. No supervisors available. They're all covering events. I considered the schedule. How long is the tour? 90 minutes. I closed the folder. I'll do it. She blinked. Personally. They're guests. You have board calls. I'll move them. She smiled knowingly. You actually enjoy these tours? I do. Because resorts reveal themselves differently when viewed through guests' eyes. You notice questions executives never think to ask. At 10 o'clock sharp, I met the small tour group in the main lobby. Only 6 people. A retired couple from Oregon. 2 travel writers. Daniel. Sophia. Neither of them seemed to expect me. Daniel looked genuinely surprised. I didn't realize you'd be leading this. I'm filling in. He smiled awkwardly. Still rescuing operations. I laughed. Something like that. We began walking slowly through the grounds. I explained the history of the original property, the restoration of the gardens, the sustainability program, the employee apprenticeship initiative, the architecture, the coastal preservation partnership. Guests asked thoughtful questions. I answered each one. Eventually one of the travel writers asked, "How long have you worked here?" Almost 3 years. You must know the owners well. I've met them. Technically true. Daniel smiled. They're lucky to have someone who understands the place this well. I thanked him. Then we continued walking. The tour ended at the western overlook, where the entire resort stretched below us. White buildings, palm trees, private beach, infinity pools shimmering under the afternoon sun. One of the retired guests quietly said, "Whoever owns this must be incredibly proud." I looked across the property. Not at the buildings. At the gardeners trimming hedges. The housekeepers pushing carts. The chefs unloading fresh produce. The maintenance team inspecting pathways before evening service. Then I answered, "I hope they're grateful." The group nodded, perhaps thinking it was simply a thoughtful remark. Only I understood the difference. Pride focuses on ownership. Gratitude remembers responsibility. And responsibility had always mattered more to me than being noticed. By sunset, however, that quiet balance was about to change in a way none of us had planned. The sun had almost disappeared behind the horizon when my assistant found me near the conference center. "There you are. You sound relieved." "I am." She handed me a leather portfolio. The board moved tomorrow's signing ceremony forward. To what time? 9:30. I checked my watch. That gives legal enough time. They're already setting up the ballroom. I nodded. Every year we held a quiet ceremony recognizing major milestones across the company. Some years it was a new acquisition. Other years it was an employee ownership initiative or a charitable partnership. This year was different. We had completed the final purchase of the neighboring coastal property after nearly 18 months of negotiations. Once the documents were signed, our hospitality group would officially own and operate the entire peninsula. 2 resorts, 1 conference center, 3 private beaches, nearly 600 employees. It wasn't designed as a publicity event. Just a meeting with board members, legal counsel, lenders, and senior leadership. Most guests would never even know it was happening. The next morning I arrived before sunrise. Old habit. The lobby was quiet, except for the soft hum of luggage carts being prepared for departing guests. I walked through the gardens with a cup of coffee, reviewing notes for the meeting. Capital improvements. Employee housing. Environmental restoration. Scholarship funding. Those were the items that interested me. The acquisition itself was almost an afterthought. Owning something had never excited me as much as improving it. At 8:15 my assistant approached. Everything's ready. Any changes? Only one. She looked down at her tablet. Several guests have asked about the ballroom because they saw the floral arrangements. They're beautiful. They are. She smiled. We've simply told everyone it's a private corporate event. Perfect. Meanwhile, Daniel and Sophia were checking out after breakfast. Their flight wasn't until late afternoon, so they planned to spend a few more hours exploring the grounds. As luck, or perhaps timing, would have it, their walk took them past the ballroom entrance just as our executives began arriving. Black suits, name badges, legal teams carrying document cases, regional managers greeting one another. Nothing unusual from the outside. Daniel slowed. Looks important. Sophia glanced through the open doors. Maybe it's an owners' conference. He nodded. Probably. Neither intended to stop. Then someone inside called my name. Ladies and gentlemen. Our chairman's voice carried easily through the hallway. Evelyn will be here in just a moment. Daniel looked instinctively toward the entrance. Curiosity is a powerful thing. So they stepped inside the back of the ballroom. No one asked them to leave. The ceremony hadn't started yet. Guests occasionally wandered into conference spaces before realizing they were private. It happened all the time. The ballroom overlooked the ocean through floor-to-ceiling windows. A long table sat at the front covered with neatly arranged folders. Behind it stood a large screen displaying a simple title. Meridian Hospitality Collection Annual Leadership Assembly. No flashy graphics. No dramatic music. Just understated professionalism. Around 80 executives and board members filled the room. Conversations gradually quieted as I entered through the side doors. I wasn't wearing anything particularly remarkable. A cream-colored blazer. Navy dress. Simple pearl earrings my mother had given me years earlier. Nothing expensive enough to attract attention. Several people stood as I approached. Not because of protocol. Because they always did. The chairman smiled. There you are. Traffic. He laughed. On your own property. Housekeeping had priority. That earned a ripple of quiet laughter around the room. I took my seat. Only then did I notice movement near the back. Daniel, Sophia, standing just inside the doorway. They looked as though they had wandered into the wrong classroom and weren't quite sure whether to leave. Before I could signal someone to help them, the chairman tapped the microphone. Good morning, everyone. The room settled. We'll begin with today's first agenda item. He looked toward me. For those joining us from our newest properties, I'd like to formally recognize the person whose leadership made this acquisition possible. Daniel's attention shifted from the screen. To me. The chairman continued. 3 years ago, when many believed this resort had reached its peak, our chief executive officer argued the opposite. A few people smiled knowingly. She believed that investing in people before buildings would transform not only this property, but every property in our collection. He paused. I'll admit, I doubted her. Soft laughter. I'm very glad I was wrong. He turned toward me. Evelyn, would you join me? The room erupted into warm, sustained applause. Not explosive. Respectful. The kind earned over years rather than moments. I stood, walked to the front, accepted the folder he handed me. Then he added the sentence no one, including Daniel, had expected. As of today's signing, the resort many of you are sitting in, along with the neighbouring coastal estate, will officially become part of the expanded portfolio personally overseen by Evelyn Bennett. He smiled. And since several people still insist on introducing her too modestly, allow me to be perfectly clear. He gestured toward the windows overlooking the ocean. Everything you can see from this ballroom is under her leadership. Silence. Not in the room. In the doorway. Daniel didn't move. His expression didn't collapse dramatically. It simply stopped. As though his mind had received information it couldn't immediately organize. He looked out the windows. Across the pools, the gardens, the villas, the beach, then back at me. Finally, the scattered conversations we'd had over the previous 2 days seemed to rearrange themselves inside his memory. The executives waiting for me. Department heads asking for approvals. The chef discussing menus. The regional directors. The private meetings. The staff who greeted me by name. None of it had been coincidence. Sophia looked from the chairman to me, then quietly toward Daniel. Very softly, almost in a whisper, she asked, Daniel, and she owns this? He answered without taking his eyes off me. Zai. He swallowed. I don't think she just owns it. He watched another board member hand me additional documents for signature. I think, and she built all of this. And for the first time since he'd walked into the resort, he wasn't looking at me as the woman he had once called ordinary. He was looking at someone he had never truly taken the time to understand. The applause faded. People returned to their seats. Legal counsel began distributing the final documents. From where I stood, I could still see Daniel and Sophia near the ballroom entrance. Neither of them interrupted. Neither tried to come forward. They simply watched. The ceremony lasted another 30 minutes. There were signatures, brief remarks, questions from board members about expansion timelines and environmental permits. Routine business. The kind of work that rarely appears in magazine articles, but determines whether thousands of future decisions become easier or harder. Eventually, the chairman closed his folder. Thank you, everyone. Chairs slid backward. Conversations resumed. Groups formed naturally around the room. As always happened after leadership meetings, I answered questions from finance, congratulated our construction director, spoke with 2 managers about employee housing. By the time I looked toward the doorway again, Daniel was waiting alone. Sophia had quietly stepped outside. Not to avoid me. To give us privacy. I appreciated that. And when the room finally emptied, Daniel walked over. For a second, we simply stood there. The ocean shimmered through the windows behind us. I owe you an apology. His voice was calm. Not theatrical. Not desperate. I've actually owed you one for years. And I listened. When we divorced. He searched for the right words. I convinced myself I understood who you were. A small smile crossed my face. We all do that. No. He shook his head. I reduced you to the version that made sense to me. Silence settled between us. I called you ordinary. You did. I believed consistency meant a lack of ambition. He looked around the ballroom. I couldn't have been more wrong. I considered his words carefully before answering. You weren't wrong about everything. His eyebrows lifted. I was comfortable. You were. I liked routines. You did. I wasn't interested in impressing people. Also true. I smiled gently. The difference is, I looked through the windows toward the gardens where employees were preparing for afternoon arrivals. Those things were never limitations. They were simply priorities. Daniel nodded slowly. I see that now. I know. He laughed quietly. You know, I saw your face when the chairman started talking. That made him laugh a little harder. I suppose I wasn't very subtle. No, another comfortable silence. Very different from the uncomfortable silences that had filled the final months of our marriage. Those had been full of things left unsaid. This one contained acceptance. I have to ask, he said eventually. When did all this happen? It didn't. He looked confused. What do you mean? There wasn't one moment. I leaned lightly against the table. It was thousands of small ones. The early mornings. The notebooks. The meetings. The employees. The properties. The mistakes. The improvements. I smiled. People usually notice success when it becomes visible. They almost never notice the years it spent becoming inevitable. He looked down for a moment. I never noticed. I know. You deserved better. I thought about that sentence. Years earlier, hearing it might have broken me. Now, it simply felt true. Thank you. He took a slow breath. I've replayed our last conversation more times than I'd like to admit. So have I. I wish I'd chosen different words. I believe you. He met my eyes. No. His voice became quieter. I wish I'd been a different man. There wasn't much to say after that. Some regrets don't need responses. They only need witnesses. A few moments later, Sophia returned. She approached with the same quiet grace she'd shown since we met. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, I said. She looked at me warmly. I wanted to congratulate you. Thank you. Daniel glanced toward her. I was just apologizing. She nodded. I imagined you might be. Then she turned back to me. He talks about work all the time. I smiled. Some habits never change. She laughed. No. After a brief pause, she added something unexpected. Yesterday, during the property tour, when you spoke about gratitude instead of pride, I wrote it down. I looked surprised. You did. She pulled out her phone. There it was in her notes. Pride focuses on ownership. Gratitude remembers responsibility. I thought it was beautiful. For a moment I forgot entirely who she was. She wasn't the younger woman. She was simply another person trying to make sense of her own life. Just as I had once been. I'm glad it meant something. It did. She slipped the phone back into her bag. And for what it's worth. She smiled gently. I don't think you were ever ordinary. Then she and Daniel thanked me once more and walked toward the exit together. I watched them leave. Not with triumph. Not with sadness. Just with an odd sense of completion. Some chapters don't end when people walk away. They end when the story no longer controls you. And that afternoon I returned to work. Not because I was avoiding emotions. Because 3 air conditioning units required replacement before summer occupancy reached.